This video is audio content only. It does not contain any video footage or images. If you are expecting visual content, please be aware. This is intentionally provided in an audio-only format. We recommend listening to the audio rather than watching the screen. Thank you for your understanding. Welcome, and thank you for joining us on this journey to discover the Chechen people, a resilient nation with a rich cultural heritage spanning centuries in the North Caucasus. In this narration, we'll explore the fascinating traditions, history, and identity of the Chechen community, from their ancient mountain roots to their enduring spirit through times of both triumph and hardship. You'll learn about their unique language, vibrant customs, and the values that have sustained their culture across generations. Whether you're encountering this remarkable people for the first time or deepening your understanding, prepare to be moved by their extraordinary story. Chapter 1. The Teip and Tukkhum System. In the steep valleys and windswept highlands of the North Caucasus, the Chechen people developed a form of social organization so distinctive that it set them apart from virtually every other society in the region. While their neighbors built kingdoms with princes and peasants, erected palaces for monarchs, and collected taxes from subjects, the Chechens chose a different path entirely. Their homeland became, as historians have noted with some amazement, the only territory in the Caucasus where feudal structures never took hold. No kings ruled from thrones, no nobles demanded tribute, no state apparatus wielded centralized power. Instead, Chechen society organized itself around an intricate web of family connections, clan loyalties, and tribal confederations that proved remarkably resilient across centuries of external pressure and internal challenge. This system functioned as genuine governance without the machinery of statehood, a remarkable achievement that challenges assumptions about how human societies must organize themselves. At the foundation of this social structure sat the Teip, a patrilineal clan whose members traced their descent from a common ancestor. These were not small family units but substantial communities, each comprising dozens or even hundreds of families bound together by blood and tradition. The Chechen Rands contained approximately 130 such Teips, each with its own identity, its own territory, and its own proud history. A Chechen did not simply belong to a family. He belonged to a Teip, and that membership shaped nearly every aspect of his existence from birth until death and beyond. The Teip determined where a Chechen could marry, for the system operated on strict exogamous principles. A man could not take a wife from within his own Teip. He had to look elsewhere, forging marriage alliances with other clans that strengthened the broader social fabric while preventing the concentration of power within any single lineage. This requirement extended even further. Marriage between blood relatives remained forbidden across 3 generations, ensuring that the genetic and social health of the community remained robust. When a young man sought a bride, her family required a dowry paid by the groom's family. This payment served not as a purchase price, but as a guarantee against divorce, a security ensuring that the marriage would be treated with appropriate seriousness by all parties involved. These marriage rules formed a crucial structural mechanism that bound the entire Chechen nation together through kinship networks that crossed territorial and political boundaries. Each Teip possessed its own territory, usually centered on a highland village where the clan had lived for generations. These were not mere residential areas, but spaces of profound ancestral significance. Every Teip maintained its own holy mountain, a peak that served as the spiritual and symbolic center of clan identity. These sacred mountains were not interchangeable. Each Teip's holy mountain was uniquely theirs, the place where heaven and earth met for that particular lineage. The holy mountains anchored the Teips to specific landscapes, creating a deep connection between clan identity and physical geography that made the Chechens extraordinarily difficult to uproot or assimilate. The land itself belonged to the Teip as a collective entity. Individual ownership, as understood in feudal societies, held no place in this system. Instead, the clan held the land jointly, with usage rights distributed among families according to need and custom. Each tape controlled its own communal fields and pastures, its own cemetery where the bones of countless ancestors rested. In the period before Islam spread through the region, each tape maintained its own shrines, places where clan members could connect with the spiritual forces that watched over their particular lineage. This collective landownership prevented the emergence of a landowning aristocracy and ensured that no family within the tape could accumulate enough property to dominate the others. Rising from these highland villages stood the most visible symbol of tape identity and power, the defense towers. Families of means constructed 5-story stone towers, architectural marvels that served dual purposes as residences and military fortifications. These towers, some of which still stand today as testament to Chechen engineering and determination, were not the palaces of princes but the communal property of the tape. Typically, one tower stood in each village, though larger or more prosperous clans might boast several. When danger approached, whether from foreign invaders or hostile neighboring clans, the tape members could retreat into these towers, hauling up supplies and preparing for a siege that might last weeks. The towers represented more than defensive positions. They embodied the clan's permanence, its willingness to defend its land and people, its rootedness in a specific place that no external force could easily dislodge. But the tape did not stand alone in the Chechen social landscape. These individual clans grouped themselves into larger associations called Tukkhums, tribal confederations that united multiple tapes under a common banner. 9 major Tukkhums existed in traditional Chechen society, each comprising numerous tapes that acknowledged mutual obligations of support and defense. The largest and most powerful of these confederations was the Nakchi-Makskoi, based in the central and eastern foothills of Chechnya in a region known as Ichkeria. The very name Nakchi, which Chechens used to refer to themselves as a people, derives from this dominant confederation. Other Chechen groups, watching the Nakchi-Makskoi grow in numbers and influence, gradually adopted the ethnonym as their own, until Nakchi came to encompass not just one Tukkhum, but the entire Chechen nation. The Tukkhums served crucial functions that individual tapes could not manage alone. When external threats materialized, whether from Mongol horsemen sweeping across the plains or Persian armies advancing from the south, the Tukkhum coordinated defense efforts across multiple clans. Tapes within a Tukkhum maintained mutual economic obligations, helping one another through hard winters or failed harvests. They intermarried frequently, though always respecting the exogamous rules that prevented marriage within the tape itself. Over time, each Tukkhum developed its own dialect, subtle variations in the Chechen language that marked a speaker's tribal affiliation to any attentive listener. These linguistic differences were not barriers to communication, but rather badges of identity, ways of proclaiming one's place in the intricate social hierarchy that structured Chechen life. Yet even with these layered affiliations, the Chechen social structure remained fundamentally egalitarian. At each level of organization, from the extended family known as the Dosal, up through the Gar, the Nekia, the Teip, and the Tukkhum to the Mech, or country as a whole, decision-making power rested with councils of elders. These were not hereditary positions passed from father to son regardless of merit. Instead, elders earned their seats through demonstrated wisdom, courage, and adherence to traditional values. A man might be relatively young in years, but old in reputation, and reputation mattered more than age alone. These councils deliberated on matters affecting their communities, from the proper time for spring planting to whether the clan should support a military expedition against encroaching enemies. Women played important roles within this system, particularly mothers and elder women who wielded considerable influence over family decisions and could shape council deliberations through their sons and male relatives. The councils operated under the framework of the Adat, an ancient code of common law that governed Chechen society long before Russian conquest brought Tsarist legal codes to the region. The Adat was not written in books or proclaimed by kings. It lived in the collective memory of the people, passed down through generations as a set of principles that defined proper conduct and prescribed remedies for transgressions. Under the Adat, disputes between families or tebs were resolved through mediation by respected elders. with compensation payments often substituting for violent retribution. The Adat also governed resource use and environmental stewardship. Animals could not be hunted while they were grazing peacefully. Cutting down a fruit-bearing tree required a decision by the community, not the whim of any individual. These provisions reflected a deep understanding that the harsh mountain environment demanded careful management. The Chechens lived at the edge of what the land could support, and the Adat encoded ecological wisdom into binding social obligation. When disputes arose that the Adat could not resolve through mediation, the system provided for justice through blood feuding, a practice that operated according to strict rules and limitations. If a member of one Teip murdered a member of another, the victim's family had the right and the duty to exact equivalent vengeance. This was not random violence, but carefully calibrated retribution. The penalty for murder was death. The penalty for lesser offenses varied according to the harm done. Respected elders often intervened in blood feuds, negotiating settlements that might involve payment of compensation rather than the taking of another life. The system's very existence, with its promise of certain retaliation for wrongdoing, helped maintain order in a society without police forces or courts in the modern sense. This social organization shaped the economic life of the Chechens in fundamental ways. The Chechen territories stretched from the high peaks of the Caucasus Mountains down through foothills and into the fertile plains along rivers like the Terek and Sunja. This vertical distribution created natural economic interdependence between highland and lowland clans. The mountain Teips, living above the tree line where farming was marginal at best, specialized in animal husbandry. They bred fine-fleeced sheep that could survive the harsh winters at altitude, producing wool and meat for trade. Meanwhile, the lowland Teips cultivated grain and vegetables in the rich soil of the plains, growing the food that sustained the broader population. Neither group could survive independently. The highlanders needed grain. The lowlanders needed wool and meat. This mutual dependence reinforced the Tukkhum system, providing economic incentives for the maintenance of tribal confederations that linked mountain and plain. When climate fluctuated, as it did during the Little Ice Age, these relationships proved crucial to survival. As glaciers advanced and growing seasons shortened, highland farming became increasingly difficult. Families and entire Teips migrated downward, seeking land that could still support agriculture. The lowlands, already more densely populated, absorbed these refugees according to rules mediated by the Tukkhum councils. What might have become violent conflict over scarce resources instead became managed migration, proof of the social system's flexibility and effectiveness. This social system, with its Teips and Tukkhums, its councils of elders and codes of governance, proved remarkably durable. It survived the Mongol invasions of the 13th century, though those invasions inflicted terrible damage and forced many Teips to retreat into the most inaccessible mountain refuges. It survived the campaigns of Tamerlanes in the 14th century, which, according to Chechen oral tradition, reduced the population by 2/3 through massacre and disease. It survived the Russian conquest in the 19th century. Most remarkably, it survived the Soviet era, when communist authorities officially abolished clan structures and worked systematically to destroy traditional forms of organization. The Teips and Tukkhums continue to function underground, maintaining their networks and identities even when public acknowledgement of clan affiliation could bring punishment. As one Chechen saying puts it, the wolves survived because they hunted in packs. The clan system provided the pack structure that allowed the Chechen people to endure attempts at cultural annihilation. Modern Chechens, whether living in their homeland or scattered across the diaspora, still identify strongly with their Teips. They know their clan history, can recite the names of ancestors back through multiple generations, and observe the ancient prohibitions against marrying within the clan. When Chechens meet as strangers in a foreign city, among the first questions they ask each other is which Teip each belongs to. The answer provides instant context, a framework for understanding family background, regional origin, and social connections. In this way, the traditional social organization continues to function not as a relic of the past, but as a living system that provides identity and community to a people whose history has been marked by repeated displacement and trauma. The Teip and Tukkhum system represents more than an interesting anthropological curiosity. It embodies a coherent answer to fundamental questions about how human beings can organize themselves, distribute resources, resolve conflicts, and maintain order without resorting to centralized state power. That this system developed and persisted in one small corner of the Caucasus while feudalism and monarchy dominated nearly everywhere else in Eurasia demonstrates that alternative forms of social organization can succeed under the right circumstances. For the Chechens, those circumstances included mountainous terrain that made centralized control difficult, a military culture that allowed the people to defend themselves without relying on professional armies, and a social structure that distributed power horizontally through councils rather than concentrating it vertically in royal dynasties. Understanding this traditional social organization provides essential context for everything else about Chechen history and identity. Without grasping the significance of the Teip and the Tukkhum, the rest of the Chechen story remains opaque, a series of events without adequate explanation for why this small nation has so consistently resisted external domination and maintained its distinct character across centuries of pressure to assimilate. Chapter 2. Faith in the Mountains. Long before the call to prayer echoed from minarets across the Chechen highlands, before the elegant Arabic script of the Quran replaced older forms of writing, before the faithful turned 5 times daily toward Mecca, the Chechen people practiced their own ancient faith. This indigenous religion, rooted in the mountain landscape that shaped every aspect of Chechen existence, centered on forces of nature and the spirits of ancestors. Rain came not from meteorological processes, but from divine favor that had to be courted through ritual. Thunder announced the presence of Sela, a powerful deity whose day the Chechens marked with special observances. The goddess Tusholi received her own annual celebration, a festival where communities gathered to honor the feminine divine and seek blessings for fertility and abundance. These were not occasional superstitions overlaying a more sophisticated belief system. They formed the core of Chechen spirituality for centuries, perhaps millennia. Each type maintained its own shrines in the highland villages, sacred spaces where clan members could communicate with the powers that governed their world. These shrines often occupied prominent locations, perhaps on a hillside overlooking the village or near a distinctive natural feature like an ancient tree or unusual rock formation. Families brought offerings to these sites, grain from the harvest, the first milk of spring, sometimes an animal sacrifice on occasions of particular importance. They sought protection for newborn children, success in upcoming ventures, healing for the sick. The rituals followed patterns passed down through countless generations, their origins lost in the mists of time, but their efficacy unquestioned by those who performed them. The preservation of Chechen history and values occurred not through written texts, but through Ilish, epic poems, and oral narratives that traveled from mouth to ear across generations. These were not simple entertainment, but sacred repositories of collective memory. An accomplished storyteller could recite Ilish for hours, spinning tales of heroic ancestors who defended their lands against impossible odds, of wise elders who resolved conflicts through clever negotiation, of tragic lovers separated by clan rivalries or hostile invasions. Through these stories, Chechen children learned who they were and what their people valued. The Ilish encoded the moral universe of pre-Islamic Chechnya, teaching lessons about courage, honor, hospitality, and the proper relationship between humans and the natural world that sustained them. These were not simple entertainment. Yet this ancient world was not as isolated as the mountain barriers might suggest. By the 8th century, Christianity had found its way into parts of Chechnya, likely carried by missionaries from Georgia or Armenia, kingdoms to the south where Christianity had taken root centuries earlier. Evidence of this Christian presence survives in the ruins of church buildings that archaeologists have discovered scattered through Chechen territory. These were not grand cathedrals, but modest structures, suggesting a faith that coexisted with, rather than displaced, the older pagan traditions. Some Chechens converted, at least nominally, accepting baptism and Christian names while perhaps maintaining private devotion to the old gods. In some regions, Christian practices left lasting marks on local culture. Certain healing rituals incorporated prayers that, while no longer understood as Christian, likely originated in Orthodox traditions. Some tapes preserved stories of saints or holy figures whose names suggested Georgian or Armenian origins, transformed over centuries into local legends detached from their Christian roots. The legacy of this Christian period persists in unexpected places. The Chechen language, though unrelated to the Indo-European tongues spoken by neighboring Christian peoples, carries traces of Christian influence in its vocabulary. The word for Sunday translates literally as God's Day, echoing the Christian Sabbath tradition. Friday, the Muslim holy day, bears a name that means Day of Mary, a reference to the Virgin Mary that would make no sense without prior Christian influence. Even the word for cross entered Chechen from Georgian, suggesting that Christian symbols once held significance in these mountains. These linguistic fossils, preserved in everyday speech long after the religious context that created them had vanished, testify to a more complex religious history than simple narratives of Islamic conversion might suggest. Christianity's hold on Chechnya remained tenuous. The religion never achieved the deep penetration it managed among Georgians or Armenians. By the late 17th century, whatever Christian presence had existed had faded almost completely, leaving behind only those linguistic traces and crumbling stone ruins. Into this vacuum flowed a different faith, one that would prove far more durable and culturally transformative than Christianity had managed to be. Islam reached Chechnya not through military conquest, but through the gradual migration and settlement of Muslim peoples from the south and east. During the 16th century, Muslim traders, craftsmen, and refugees from various conflicts in the broader Islamic world began appearing in Chechen lands. They brought with them the practices of their faith, the 5 daily prayers, the annual fast of Ramadan, the pilgrimage to Mecca for those who could afford it, and most importantly, the uncompromising monotheism that stood in stark contrast to the polytheistic paganism still practiced by most Chechens. These Muslim settlers did not arrive as missionaries intent on conversion. They came seeking safety or economic opportunity. Yet their presence gradually exposed Chechens to Islamic ideas and practices. The conversion process unfolded slowly over more than 2 centuries. Some Chechens, particularly those living in lowland areas where contact with Muslim traders was most frequent, adopted Islam in the 16th or 17th century. Others, especially in remote mountain villages, clung to the old ways well into the 19th century. This was not a conversion driven by state power or military force, but a grassroots transformation shaped by individual choices and social pressures. A Chechen might convert because he married a Muslim woman, or because Islamic merchants offered better trade terms to fellow Muslims, or simply because the new faith seemed to offer something the old religion could not provide in changing times. The form of Islam that took root in Chechnya was Sunni, specifically following the Shafi'i school of Islamic jurisprudence, one of 4 major schools of legal interpretation in Sunni Islam. The Shafi'i school, which originated with the 9th century jurist Muhammad ibn Idris al-Shafi'i, emphasizes the primacy of the Quran and Hadith while allowing for reasoned interpretation in cases where these sources provide no clear guidance. This school predominates throughout the Caucasus and parts of Central Asia, creating religious continuity between Chechens and their Muslim neighbors in Dagestan and beyond. But more important than these formal legal distinctions was the mystical, devotional character of Chechen Islam. The faith arrived in its Sufi manifestation, emphasizing direct personal experience of the divine over strict adherence to legal codes, celebrating the ecstatic practices of dhikr, or remembrance of God, and organizing believers into spiritual brotherhoods under the guidance of living masters. 2 major Sufi orders, or tariqas, established themselves in Chechnya, the Naqshbandiya and the Qadiriya. The Naqshbandiya arrived first, brought by Dagestani Muslims in the 18th century. This order emphasized silent meditation and sober practice, appealing to Chechens who valued discipline and self-control. The Kadiriya came later, in the 19th century, bringing a more emotional and ecstatic style of worship. Kadiri dhikr sessions featured rhythmic chanting of the names of God and the Prophet, accompanied by swaying movements that grew more intense as the ceremony progressed. Participants might whirl like dervishes or rock back and forth in unison, the collective rhythm inducing trance states in which worshippers felt themselves approaching direct communion with the divine. These sessions could last for hours, the participants entering altered states of consciousness that they understood as windows into spiritual reality beyond the material world. Within each tariqa, believers organized into smaller groups called verds, each following a particular sheikh or spiritual guide. These verds functioned as intimate communities of practice, typically numbering several dozen members who gathered regularly under their sheikh's leadership. Each verd traced its spiritual lineage through a chain of masters reaching back to the founder of the tariqa and ultimately to the Prophet Muhammad himself. The sheikh served not merely as a teacher, but as a living conduit of divine grace, his authority derived from this unbroken chain of transmission. A Chechen might identify himself not merely as Kadiri or Naqshbandi, but as a follower of Sheikh so-and-so, emphasizing the personal relationship at the heart of Sufi practice. This Sufi character profoundly shaped how Islam integrated with existing Chechen culture. Unlike the strict, legalistic Islam practiced in Arabia, Chechen Sufism proved remarkably flexible and accommodating. It did not demand the immediate and total abandonment of all pre-Islamic practices. Elements of the old pagan religion persisted, gradually acquiring Islamic interpretations. Sacred sites associated with pre-Islamic spirits became the tombs of Muslim saints, places where believers could seek intercession with God through the spiritual power of the righteous dead. Rituals invoking natural forces were reframed as prayers to Allah. The veneration of ancestors folded into Islamic concepts of honoring the righteous dead. In this way, Islam provided a new framework for understanding traditional practices rather than simply prohibiting them. The tariqa structure also meshed well with the Teip and Tukkhum organization that already structured Chechen society. Just as a Chechen belonged to a clan and tribe by birth, he now joined a spiritual brotherhood that gave him another layer of identity and connection. The relationship between a Sufi disciple and his sheikh paralleled in some ways the relationship between a young Chechen and his Teip elders, both emphasizing respect, obedience, and the transmission of wisdom from older to younger generations. Religious authority and clan authority often overlapped. A respected elder might also be a sheikh within a tariqa, wielding influence over his followers' spiritual and worldly affairs simultaneously. Yet Chechen Islam never achieved the totalizing dominance over daily life that characterized some Muslim societies. The adat, the traditional code of customary law, continued to govern most social and legal matters even after the Chechen conversion to Islam. When disputes arose over property boundaries, Chechens typically turned to their councils of elders, who might rule that the offending party owed compensation according to traditional formulas. So many cattle for this offense, a feast for the aggrieved clan for that one. When questions of marriage arose, the adat determined bride price and the obligations of each family, often with little reference to Islamic law. Even in cases of blood feud, the ancient principle of an eye for an eye held sway, though gradually Islamic concepts of mercy and reconciliation began to influence how these conflicts might be resolved. A sheikh might intervene in a feud, using his religious authority to broker peace, and arguing that God favored forgiveness over vengeance. In this way, Sharia and Adat entered into dialogue, each modifying the other over generations until the resulting synthesis was distinctively Chechen. Daily religious practice in traditional Chechen Muslim society followed patterns familiar to Sunni Muslims elsewhere, but with distinctive local coloring. Men gathered for communal prayers at mosques, though the mountain geography meant that many villages lacked formal mosques, and prayers might be conducted in someone's home or outdoors. Friday prayers held special importance as the main weekly gathering of the community, when men from scattered homesteads converged on the village center to pray together and hear the imam's sermon. Women generally prayed at home, though their exclusion from mosque attendance reflected cultural tradition rather than strict religious requirement. During Ramadan, the holy month of fasting, Chechens abstained from food and drink from dawn to sunset, breaking their fast each evening with family and community meals that reinforced social bonds. Those with sufficient means aspired to make the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, at least once in their lifetime, returning with the honored title of Haji and stories of the holy cities that their neighbors might never see. Religious leaders occupied important positions in this society without completely dominating it. A respected imam or sheikh commanded genuine authority, particularly in spiritual matters and questions of religious law. His interpretations of Islamic teachings influenced how Chechens understood their obligations as Muslims. During the Russian conquest of the Caucasus in the 19th century, religious leaders emerged as crucial figures in organizing resistance. Imam Shamil, the legendary Chechen and Dagestani leader who fought Russian forces from 1834 until his surrender in 1859, framed the conflict explicitly in religious terms. He sought to create an Islamic emirate, a state governed by Islamic law, in opposition to the Christian Russian Empire. His movement combined Chechen desires for independence with the unifying power of Islamic identity, creating a formidable resistance that required decades and enormous Russian military resources to suppress. The Russian conquest, when it finally succeeded, brought new pressures on Chechen religious practice. The Tsarist authorities, while permitting Islam to continue, kept close watch on religious leaders who might foment rebellion. They attempted to channel Islamic practice into forms they considered safe and manageable, supporting conservative religious figures who preached quietism and obedience to state authority, while suppressing those who advocated resistance. This dynamic intensified dramatically under Soviet rule. When the Bolsheviks took power in Russia in 1917 and subsequently established control over Chechnya, they brought with them an ideology explicitly hostile to all religion. Marxism-Leninism taught that religion was the opium of the people, a tool of oppression that kept the masses compliant while their exploiters grew rich. The Soviet state embarked on aggressive campaigns to eliminate religious belief and practice throughout its territory, and Chechnya, with its deeply rooted Islamic identity, became a particular target of these efforts. Mosques were closed, their buildings converted to warehouses or meeting halls. Religious schools where young Chechens had learned to read Arabic and study the Quran were shuttered. Clerics were arrested, exiled to labor camps in Siberia, or simply executed as enemies of the Soviet state. Public practice of Islam became dangerous, potentially marking a person as politically unreliable or actively counter-revolutionary. The 1944 deportation, covered in detail in Chapter 3, represented the peak of anti-Islamic repression, though even in exile, Chechens maintained their faith in secret. When Chechens were finally permitted to return to their homeland in 1957, after Stalin's death and the beginnings of de-Stalinization under Nikita Khrushchev, they brought an intensified religious commitment with them. They found a landscape transformed, their villages occupied by Russians and other settlers, their mosques destroyed, their cemeteries desecrated. But they also found that the Soviet attempt at cultural erasure had limits. Memory persisted, identity endured. And very gradually, under the relatively more tolerant conditions of the late Soviet period, Chechen religious life began to regenerate. In 1978, the Soviet authorities permitted the reopening of 2 mosques in Chechen territory. For a population of nearly 1 million people, 2 official mosques represented an absurdly inadequate concession. Yet even this tiny opening created space for revival. These mosques became far more than places of worship. They functioned as community centers where Chechens could gather legally under an Islamic banner, as educational institutions where knowledge of Arabic and Quranic interpretation could be transmitted to younger generations, and as symbols of survival, proving that 7 decades of repression had not succeeded in extinguishing Chechen Islam. Lines formed before Friday prayers, with hundreds of men waiting for their turn inside the overcrowded buildings. Young Chechens who had grown up without access to formal Islamic education sought out elders who remembered the old traditions. Men traveled to Dagestan, an important center of Islamic learning in the North Caucasus, to receive religious training that was unavailable in Chechnya itself. This underground educational network produced a new generation of religious leaders who would play crucial roles in Chechen society during the tumultuous decades to come. Lines formed before Friday prayers, with hundreds of men waiting for their turn inside the overcrowded buildings. Young Chechens who had grown up without access to formal Islamic education sought out elders who remembered the old traditions. Men traveled to Dagestan, an important center of Islamic learning in the North Caucasus, to receive religious training that was unavailable in Chechnya itself. This underground educational network produced a new generation of religious leaders who would play crucial roles in Chechen society during the tumultuous decades to come. The collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 removed the constraints that had limited religious expression for 7 decades. Mosques multiplied rapidly across Chechnya. Religious schools reopened, now legal and even receiving some government support. Chechens who had practiced their faith in secret could now pray publicly without fear of arrest. Islamic holidays, suppressed for generations, returned to the calendar. Women who wished to wear headscarves could do so without risking their careers or their children's educational opportunities. This religious flowering coincided with and reinforced the surge of Chechen nationalism that led to the Declaration of Independence and the subsequent wars with Russia. But this period of religious freedom also brought tensions that had not existed in traditional Chechen Islam. During the wars, foreign fighters arrived from various parts of the Muslim world, bringing with them Wahhabi and Salafi interpretations of Islam that differed dramatically from Chechen Sufism. These more puritanical forms of the faith rejected many traditional Chechen practices as innovations, unsanctioned by the Quran and the example of the Prophet. They criticized the veneration of saints, the ecstatic dhikr ceremonies, the flexibility in applying Islamic law, and the accommodation with pre-Islamic traditions that characterized Chechen religious life. They demanded strict segregation of women, prohibition of music and dance, and literal application of harsh Quranic punishments. Some younger Chechens, radicalized by the brutality of the Russian military campaigns and seeking a purer, more militant expression of their faith, found these foreign interpretations appealing. This created fractures within Chechen society that persist to the present day. The conflict was not simply about theology, but about identity itself. Was Chechen Islam, with its Sufi traditions and cultural synthesis, legitimate? Or did true faith require abandoning these local particularities in favor of a universal Islamic practice modeled on the earliest period of Islamic history? The debate sometimes turned violent, with Wahhabi militants attacking traditional religious authorities and Sufi practitioners condemning the foreigners and their local converts as ignorant extremists who understood neither Islam nor Chechen tradition. The Kadyrov era, examined in Chapter 6, brought state-sponsored revival of traditional Sufi Islam alongside strict political control of religious expression. Through all these transformations, from pagan origins through Christian contact to Islamic conversion, from Russian conquest through Soviet repression to modern revival, religion has remained central to Chechen identity in ways that go beyond simple belief in particular doctrines or performance of specific rituals. To be Chechen has come to mean, among other things, to be Muslim. This identification survived decades when practicing Islam openly meant risking everything. It survived the deportation and the attempted cultural genocide. It survived because Chechens understood, perhaps unconsciously but no less powerfully, that their faith connected them to their ancestors, to their land, and to each other in ways that no external force could permanently sever. The mosques might be destroyed, but the prayers continued. The schools might be closed, but the knowledge passed from parent to child. The sheikhs might be killed, but new spiritual guides emerged to maintain the chains of transmission that linked contemporary believers to the Prophet Muhammad and through him to God. Chapter 3. Stalin's 1944 mass deportation and exile. The winter of 1944 found the Soviet Union locked in the final brutal phase of what Russians call the Great Patriotic War. German forces, having penetrated deep into Soviet territory in the catastrophic early years of the conflict, were now in retreat. The Red Army had broken the siege of Leningrad, liberated Ukraine, and begun the long march toward Berlin that would end with the hammer and sickle flying over the Reichstag. Victory, so uncertain just 2 years earlier, now seemed inevitable. Yet even as Soviet soldiers fought and died to expel the Nazi invaders, Joseph Stalin's regime prepared to turn its formidable military apparatus against its own citizens. The target was not a fifth column of German sympathizers or a network of spies and saboteurs. The target was an entire people. The Chechens, along with their close relatives the Ingush, stood accused of collaboration with the German enemy. This charge would have struck any informed observer as peculiar, given one inconvenient fact. German troops had never occupied a single Chechen village. The Wehrmacht's advance into the Caucasus in 1942, part of Hitler's desperate bid to seize the Soviet Union's oil fields, had reached the northwestern edges of Chechen territory before being halted and thrown back. Some Chechen villages in the foothills had seen German scouts or advance patrols. But the sustained occupation that might have created conditions for actual collaboration never materialized. Most Chechens never laid eyes on a German soldier. Many Chechen men were serving in the Red Army, fighting the Nazis on distant fronts. Others had joined partisan units that harassed German supply lines in occupied territories. The official Soviet accusation of mass collaboration was, quite simply, a lie. But truth mattered little to Stalin's government, which had long viewed the Chechens with suspicion and hostility. Throughout the Soviet period, Chechen resistance to collectivization, religious persecution, and cultural Russification had marked them as unreliable in the eyes of Moscow's authorities. The war provided a convenient pretext to solve what Soviet planners had come to regard as the Chechen problem. If the Chechens would not willingly assimilate, would not abandon their clans and their Islam and their stubborn independence, then they would be removed entirely. The decision was made, the plans drawn up, and the machinery of state terror set in motion with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Stalin's worst crimes. The man charged with executing this operation was Lavrentiy Beria, head of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Beria had supervised previous deportations of other Caucasian peoples, including the Karachay and the Balkars, operations that had refined the techniques now to be applied on a much larger scale. The Chechen deportation, designated Operation Lentil in official documents, would involve the forced removal of somewhere between 400,000 and 650,000 people. Exact figures remain uncertain, the victims of a regime that kept meticulous records when it suited its purposes and destroyed evidence when convenient. What is certain is that the operation aimed at nothing less than the complete ethnic cleansing of Chechnya. The Chechens, along with their close relatives the Ingush, stood accused of collaboration with the German enemy. This charge would have struck any informed observer as peculiar, given one inconvenient fact. German troops had never occupied a single Chechen village. The Wehrmacht's advance into the Caucasus in 1942, part of Hitler's desperate bid to seize the Soviet Union's oil fields, had reached the northwestern edges of Chechen territory before being halted and thrown back. Some Chechen villages in the foothills had seen German scouts or advance patrols, but the sustained occupation that might have created conditions for actual collaboration never materialized. Most Chechens never laid eyes on a German soldier. Many Chechen men were serving in the Red Army, fighting the Nazis on distant fronts. Others had joined partisan units that harassed German supply lines in occupied territories. The official Soviet accusation of mass collaboration was, quite simply, a lie. But truth mattered little to Stalin's government, which had long viewed the Chechens with suspicion and hostility. Throughout the Soviet period, Chechen resistance to collectivization, religious persecution, and cultural Russification had marked them as unreliable in the eyes of Moscow's authorities. The war provided a convenient pretext to solve what Soviet planners had come to regard as the Chechen problem. If the Chechens would not willingly assimilate, would not abandon their clans and their Islam and their stubborn independence, then they would be removed entirely. The decision was made, the plans drawn up, and the machinery of state terror set in motion with the bureaucratic efficiency that characterized Stalin's worst crimes. The man charged with executing this operation was Lavrenti Beria, head of the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs. Beria had supervised previous deportations of other Caucasian peoples, including the Karachay and the Balkars, operations that had refined the techniques now to be applied on a much larger scale. The Chechen deportation, designated Operation Lentil in official documents, would involve the forced removal of somewhere between 400,000 and 650,000 people. Exact figures remain uncertain, the victims of a regime that kept meticulous records when it suited its purposes and destroyed evidence when convenient. What is certain is that the operation aimed at nothing less than the complete ethnic cleansing of Chechnya. February 23, 1944, was Red Army Day, a holiday celebrating the founding of Soviet military forces. In Chechen villages across the Republic, notices went out inviting all men to special celebrations honoring the Red Army's achievements. This was not unusual. Soviet authorities regularly organized such events, using holidays as occasions for propaganda and political education. Chechen men, whatever their private feelings about Soviet power, had learned that ignoring official invitations could bring unwanted attention from the authorities. So they came, gathering in village squares and community buildings, expecting speeches and perhaps some modest festivities despite wartime austerity. What they found instead were NKVD soldiers holding automatic weapons. As the men assembled, troops moved to surround them, cutting off any possibility of escape. Officers read a decree, its bureaucratic language announcing that the Chechen and English peoples were to be deported to distant regions of the Soviet Union as punishment for treason against the motherland. The men stood stunned, unable to process what they were hearing. Some had sons or brothers fighting in the Red Army. Some had survived German prisoner of war camps and made it home. Some bore wounds received defending the Soviet Union. Now they were being told they were traitors who would lose everything. While the men were detained, soldiers moved through the villages, going house to house to round up everyone who remained: women, children, the elderly, the sick. Families were given 30 minutes to gather whatever they could carry. In some places they had more time, in others less. The variation depended on the whims of individual officers or the logistics of the operation in particular locations. But nowhere was there time for anything approaching an orderly departure. Families grabbed what seemed most essential in those frantic moments: food, if they had any, warm clothing, desperately needed for a journey to unknown destinations that would certainly be colder than the relatively mild Caucasus winter. Perhaps a photograph or a treasured book, some small thing to anchor identity in the catastrophe unfolding around them. The old and infirm who could not walk faced a terrible fate. NKVD orders specified that all Chechens were to be deported, without exception. Those too sick to travel were to be carried if possible, left behind if not. Stories filtered back in later years of invalids abandoned in their homes, of elderly people too frail to move loaded onto wagons that broke down, their occupants left by the roadside. One particularly horrifying account tells of patients in a village hospital, bedridden and unable to evacuate. Rather than organize their transport, the NKVD simply locked the hospital doors and set the building aflame. When neighbors tried to help, soldiers drove them back at gunpoint. Those who could fled, those who could not burned. From villages across Chechnya and Ingushetia, the deported were brought to collection points, usually the nearest railway station. The scale of the operation was staggering. Between February 23rd and March 13th, less than 3 weeks, the NKVD moved roughly 500,000 people. This required 180 special trains comprising 5,200 freight cars, all diverted from the war effort for this operation. The cars were not passenger carriages, but boxcars designed for cargo. Into each car, 50 or 60 or 70 people were packed, pressed together so tightly that sitting down was difficult and lying down impossible for everyone at once. The cars lacked heat despite the winter cold. They lacked adequate ventilation. They lacked sanitary facilities beyond a hole cut in the floor in one corner. The doors were locked from outside and would remain locked for the next 20 to 30 days. The trains rolled east, away from the Caucasus, across the winter landscape towards Central Asia and Siberia. Inside the sealed cars, conditions deteriorated rapidly. The air grew foul with the smell of unwashed bodies and human waste. Children cried from hunger and cold and the crushing fear generated by circumstances they could not understand. The elderly, already weakened, began to die. Typhus broke out, spreading rapidly in the overcrowded, unsanitary conditions. When someone died, the body could not be removed until the train stopped, which might not happen for days. Families huddled with their dead, unable to even give them a dignified burial. At irregular intervals, the trains would halt at some desolate station. Guards would unlock the doors briefly, allowing the deportees to remove the dead, to get water if any was available, to breathe fresh air for a few precious minutes before being forced back into the cars for the journey to continue. Sometimes bread was distributed, hard black loaves that families divided carefully among themselves. Sometimes there was nothing. The NKVD had allocated minimal resources for feeding the deportees, and even those meager supplies often failed to materialize due to the inefficiency and corruption endemic in the Soviet system. Hunger gnawed constantly. Children and the elderly suffered most. Mortality rose with each passing day. One Chechen man, recounting his family's experience decades later, described the death of his 3 sisters during the transport. They contracted typhus in the overcrowded car. Within days, all 3 were dead. His parents, devastated, had to watch their daughters' bodies removed at some nameless station and dumped by the tracks, left to be buried in unmarked graves by labor crews that followed the deportation trains. Another account tells of a woman who gave birth during the journey. She was ill, weakened by the conditions in the car, and perhaps already suffering from typhus. She managed to deliver the child, a boy, but in the chaos and darkness, he was taken from her. She never saw him again. For years afterward, back in Chechnya after the deportations ended, she would search for any young man of the right age, convincing herself that perhaps this one or that one might be her lost son. Eventually, she adopted a lonely boy, allowing herself the fiction that she had found him. This small mercy, this acceptable delusion, gave her peace in her final years. The trains disgorged their human cargo at destinations scattered across the Eastern Soviet Union. Most Chechens found themselves in Kazakhstan, the vast Central Asian republic whose empty steppes seemed purpose-built for Stalin's use as a dumping ground for unwanted peoples. Others went to Kyrgyzstan, or to parts of Siberia, or to remote districts of the Russian interior. They were distributed among special settlements, villages, or collective farms, where NKVD officials registered them as special settlers, a legal category that placed them under permanent surveillance and severe restrictions. Special settlers could not leave their assigned area beyond a radius of 3 to 5 kilometers without permission. They had to report to the local NKVD office monthly, sometimes every 2 weeks, proving they had not fled. Failure to appear meant arrest and likely imprisonment in the Gulag system. The authorities assigned the deportees to work on collective farms or in factories. They received wages, but at rates far below what local workers earned for the same labor. The jobs were invariably the hardest and least desirable: field labor in all weather, work in mines or lumber camps, tasks that broke bodies and crushed spirits. Meanwhile, back in Chechnya, the Soviet government moved swiftly to erase every trace of Chechen existence. The Chechen-Ingush Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic was abolished. Its territory was divided up and attached to neighboring regions. Russians, Ukrainians, and North Caucasians from other ethnic groups were settled in Chechen homes, which the deportees had been forced to abandon with all their possessions inside. Mosques that had survived earlier Soviet anti-religious campaigns were now demolished. Cemeteries were plowed under, ancient gravestones destroyed, the bones of countless Chechen ancestors scattered by bulldozers. Place names were changed. Villages named after Chechen heroes or local landmarks were given Russian names that erased their history. Streets and squares lost their old designations. The authorities even attempted to rewrite history, commissioning new textbooks that made no mention of Chechens or presented them only as bandits and counter-revolutionaries who had rightfully been punished. This cultural genocide aimed at ensuring that even if the Chechens someday returned, they would find nothing of their heritage remaining. The deportation sought not just physical removal, but the annihilation of identity itself. Yet, this effort, like the deportation itself, ultimately failed because the authorities had underestimated the resilience of the human spirit and the power of memory. In exile, conditions were brutal, especially during the first years. The mortality rate soared. Conservative estimates suggest that at least 22% of the deported population died during the transport or in the immediate aftermath of arrival. Some scholars place the figure much higher, as much as 50% when including the excess deaths that occurred over the full 13 years of exile. These were not deaths in battle or from old age, but from starvation, disease, exposure, and the psychological devastation of having lost everything. Entire families were wiped out. The very young and the very old died in disproportionate numbers, but even healthy adults in the prime of life succumbed to the grinding brutality of their circumstances. But the Chechens did not simply disappear as Stalin's planners might have hoped. Those who survived the initial catastrophe began to adapt. Cut off from their homeland and forbidden to speak their language in public, they taught it to their children in whispers at home. Unable to practice their Islam openly in an officially atheist state, they maintained their faith in secret, teaching prayers and observing holidays behind closed doors. The clan system, that fundamental structure of Chechen social organization, persisted in exile. Types maintained their identities, even scattered across thousands of miles. When Chechens encountered each other in the special settlements, among the first questions they asked was which type each belonged to, re-establishing connections and mutual obligations that the deportation had tried to sever. Soviet authorities had hoped that the deportation would lead to the cultural assimilation of the Chechens. Removed from their homeland, stripped of their institutions, forbidden their language and religion, the next generation would grow up Russian in all but blood. This did not happen. Instead, the trauma of deportation intensified Chechen identity. The shared suffering became a defining element of what it meant to be Chechen. Parents told their children stories of the homeland, descriptions of specific villages and valleys, accounts of particular towers and mountains. These stories took on sacred qualities, preserving memories of a lost world and cultivating in the next generation a desperate longing to return. They maintained this hope through 13 years of exile, years when return seemed impossible, when Stalin still ruled and showed no sign of relenting, when the Soviet state appeared eternal and all-powerful. Then, in March 1953, Stalin died. The dictator's death did not immediately transform the Soviet Union, but it did create openings for change. Under Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, the Soviet system began a limited process of de-Stalinization, acknowledging some of the former leader's crimes and reversing some of his most brutal policies. In 1956, Khrushchev denounced Stalin in a secret speech to Communist Party leaders, detailing a long list of the dictator's abuses. This created the political space for reconsidering the deportations. The Chechens were officially rehabilitated in 1956. The false charges of collaboration dropped. The following year, they were permitted to return to their homeland. They came in massive numbers, abandoning the special settlements with barely a backward glance, cramming onto trains heading west toward the Caucasus. After 13 years of exile, of grinding poverty and constant discrimination, of living as barely tolerated foreigners in hostile lands, the Chechens were going home. What they found there would bring new challenges and sorrows, but for now they had survived what their grandchildren would remember as the Ardakh, The Exodus, perhaps the darkest chapter in the long history of a people who had endured more than their share of darkness. Chapter 4. The Chechen Wars. The return from exile in 1957 did not bring the Chechens the peace they had imagined during their 13 years in Kazakhstan and Siberia. They came home to find their villages occupied by Russians and other settlers who had no intention of leaving. The Soviet authorities, having permitted the return, did nothing to help the Chechens reclaim their homes or their land. Instead, a tense coexistence developed, with Russians living in houses that had belonged to Chechen families, farming fields that Chechen clans had cultivated for generations, and resenting the former deportees who had the audacity to come back and expect their property returned. This arrangement, imposed by Soviet power and maintained through the remaining decades of communist rule, created animosities that would explode into violence once the iron grip of the Soviet state finally loosened. That loosening began in the late 1980s under Mikhail Gorbachev, whose policies of glasnost and perestroika inadvertently set in motion forces that would tear apart the Soviet Union. Throughout the vast Soviet empire, from the Baltic republics to Central Asia, nationalist movements emerged demanding autonomy or outright independence. The Chechens watched as their neighbors in Georgia successfully broke away, establishing an independent state. They saw the 14 Union republics that made up the outer ring of Soviet territory assert their sovereignty and prepare for independence. But Chechnya was not a Union republic. It was an autonomous region within the Russian Soviet Federative Socialist Republic, one layer down in the Soviet administrative hierarchy. This meant that when the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, Chechnya remained inside the new Russian Federation, much to the fury of Chechen nationalists who believed their moment for independence had arrived. The man who would lead Chechnya's independence movement was Jokhar Dudayev, a former Soviet Air Force general who had commanded a division of strategic bombers. Dudayev was an unusual figure, a Chechen who had risen to high rank in the Soviet military, a man who spoke Russian fluently and had spent most of his adult life far from his homeland, yet who now positioned himself as a champion of Chechen nationalism. In 1990, while still in Soviet service, Dudayev had been stationed in Estonia when that Baltic republic began its push for independence. His superiors ordered him to mobilize his forces to seize control of Estonian parliament buildings and broadcast facilities, to crush the independence movement by force. Dudayev refused. He would not attack civilians seeking freedom from Russian domination. This act of conscience, or calculation, depending on interpretation, made him a hero to Estonians and marked him as politically unreliable to his Soviet commanders. This act of conscience, or calculation, depending on interpretation, made him a hero to Estonians and marked him as politically unreliable to his Soviet commanders. In 1990, Dudayev resigned from the military and returned to Chechnya, where nationalist sentiment was reaching a fever pitch. He quickly became the leader of the separatist All-National Congress of the Chechen people. In November 1991, with the Soviet Union in its death throes, Dudayev was elected president of Chechnya in elections that most observers considered reasonably fair. He immediately declared Chechnya's independence from Russia. The Russian government, now led by Boris Yeltsin, refused to recognize this declaration. For 3 years, an uneasy standoff persisted. Chechnya operated as a de facto independent state, printing its own currency, maintaining its own military forces, and conducting its own foreign policy. Russia imposed an economic blockade, trying to strangle the breakaway republic without resorting to military force. But the blockade's main effect was to push Chechnya toward lawlessness as its economy collapsed and armed groups filled the power vacuum. By late 1994, Yeltsin's government had decided that Chechnya's independence could not be tolerated. A military solution was needed. In December, Russian forces invaded, launching what would become known as the First Chechen War. The Russian military planners expected a quick victory. They possessed overwhelming advantages in numbers, equipment, and firepower. The Chechens had no air force, no tanks, no artillery beyond a few pieces captured from Russian arsenals. Their total forces numbered perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 fighters, while Russia could deploy tens of thousands of troops. On paper, it looked like a mismatch. But paper does not account for terrain, for motivation, for the willingness to die rather than surrender. The Russian advance into Chechnya proceeded slowly at first as commanders tried to minimize casualties, hoping that a show of force might persuade the Chechens to capitulate without serious fighting. This hope proved illusory. As Russian armored columns pushed toward Grozny, the Chechen capital, they encountered fierce resistance. Chechen fighters, organized into small mobile groups, struck from ambush and then melted away into the mountains or the urban landscape before Russian forces could effectively respond. They used anti-tank weapons captured from Russian armories or purchased on the black market, with stunning effectiveness, turning Russian armor into blazing wrecks on narrow mountain roads where destroyed vehicles blocked the advance of those behind. The Battle of Grozny, which began on New Year's Eve 1994 and lasted through January 1995, became a catastrophe for Russian forces. Military planners had assumed that armor and artillery would make quick work of urban resistance. Instead, Russian units found themselves trapped in a city transformed into a killing ground. Chechen fighters knew every street, every building, every sewer line and basement. They moved through the city unseen, appearing to fire rocket-propelled grenades at Russian armored vehicles and then vanishing before the Russians could return fire. They had the advantage of fighting for their homes, their families, their national survival. Russian soldiers, many of them poorly trained conscripts barely out of their teens, had no such motivation. They knew only that they were being killed in brutal urban combat for reasons their officers could not adequately explain. By the time Russian forces finally gained nominal control of Grozny in late January, the city had been reduced to rubble. Russian artillery and airstrikes had pounded buildings indiscriminately, caring little whether they hit military targets or civilian apartments. Conservative estimates put civilian deaths in the thousands during this single battle. The Chechens pulled back into the mountains, the same strategy their ancestors had used against Russian invaders in the 19th century. From strongholds in villages like Videno and Shali, they launched raids against Russian positions, ambushed supply convoys, and made clear that holding Grozny did not mean victory in Chechnya. The war dragged on through 1995 with mounting casualties on both sides. Russian commanders tried massive operations to sweep Chechen fighters from particular regions, but these always achieved temporary results at best. The Chechens would withdraw before superior Russian forces, wait for the Russians to leave, and then return. Meanwhile, Chechen fighters demonstrated their ability to strike inside Russia itself. In June 1995, a Chechen unit led by the commander Shamil Basayev seized a hospital in the southern Russian town of Budyonnovsk, taking more than 1,000 hostages. They demanded that Russia end the war and withdraw from Chechnya. When Russian special forces attempted to storm the hospital, the result was catastrophe. More than 100 people died, many of them hostages killed in the crossfire. The Budyonnovsk raid shocked Russian society, bringing the war's reality home to citizens who had imagined the conflict as something distant and manageable. By 1996, Russia faced a military stalemate and growing domestic opposition to the war. Yeltsin, facing re-election, needed to end the conflict. In August, Chechen forces launched a surprise assault on Grozny, recapturing much of the city from demoralized Russian troops. This humiliation forced Yeltsin's hand. General Alexander Lebet negotiated a ceasefire with Aslan Maskhadov, a former Soviet artillery officer who had emerged as the Chechens' most effective military commander. The Khasevyurt Accords, signed in August 1996, ended the fighting and established a framework for determining Chechnya's political status by the year 2000. Russian forces withdrew. Maskhadov was elected president of Chechnya in early 1997 in elections that international observers deemed free and fair. For the first time in centuries, Chechnya was effectively independent. But this independence brought challenges that Maskhadov's government proved unable to manage. The war had shattered Chechnya's already weak economy. Infrastructure lay in ruins. The educated professional class had fled as refugees to Russia or Europe. Unemployment was nearly universal. Into this vacuum flowed criminal gangs engaging in kidnapping for ransom, oil theft, and weapons trafficking. Foreign Islamist fighters who had come to Chechnya during the war to aid what they saw as fellow Muslims fighting against Russian aggression now refused to leave. They brought Wahhabi and Salafi interpretations of Islam that clashed with traditional Chechen Sufism, creating religious tensions that overlaid the economic chaos. These more puritanical forms of the faith rejected many traditional Chechen practices, declaring them innovations or even polytheism. Some younger Chechens, radicalized by the brutality they had witnessed and seeking a purer, more militant expression of their faith, found these foreign interpretations appealing. Muscatov attempted to negotiate with these radical elements while also trying to establish working relationships with Russia, but his position grew steadily weaker. The radicalization of part of the Chechen resistance became particularly visible in the figure of Shamil Basayev, the hero of Budyunovsk. Basayev increasingly rejected Muscatov's relatively moderate approach, allying himself with foreign fighters like the Saudi militant known as Khattab. In August 1999, Basayev and Khattab led an incursion from Chechnya into neighboring Dagestan, attempting to spark an Islamic uprising that would spread their movement beyond Chechnya's borders. The invasion failed miserably. Dagestanis, though largely Muslim, had no interest in the rigid Wahhabi Islam that Basayev was promoting, and Russian forces quickly drove the invaders back into Chechnya. This gave Russia the pretext it needed. That same month, a series of apartment bombings in Russian cities killed nearly 300 people. Russian authorities immediately blamed Chechen terrorists, though questions about the bombing's true perpetrators would linger for years. Whether the bombings were genuinely Chechen terrorist attacks or false flag operations by Russian security services remains disputed, but their political effect was undeniable. Russian public opinion, which had turned against the First Chechen War, now demanded retaliation. Vladimir Putin, recently appointed prime minister by Yeltsin, launched the Second Chechen War in October 1999, vowing to hunt down terrorists and restore Russian control over Chechnya. This second war differed dramatically from the first in both methods and outcomes. The Russian military, humiliated by its earlier defeat, approached the conflict with greater numbers, better planning, and absolute ruthlessness. Where the First War had at least paid lip service to minimizing civilian casualties, the Second War operated under no such constraints. Entire villages suspected of harboring fighters were razed to the ground. The term Zachiska, meaning cleansing operation, entered the vocabulary to describe sweeps through Chechen villages where Russian forces conducted house-to-house searches, detaining military-age men for interrogation. These operations routinely involved arbitrary arrests, beatings, torture, and extrajudicial executions. Men would be taken from their homes and never seen again. Families searching for missing relatives found only mass graves or no trace at all. The Zachiska operations terrorized the civilian population while doing little to distinguish between actual insurgents and ordinary Chechens simply trying to survive. Grozny suffered worst of all. Russian forces surrounded the city and subjected it to months of continuous bombardment. Artillery shells and missiles rained down day and night. The city that had survived the First War, though badly damaged, was now systematically destroyed. By the time Russian forces entered Grozny in early 2000, United Nations officials described it as the most destroyed city on Earth, more thoroughly devastated than Hiroshima after the atomic bomb or Dresden after the Allied firebombing in World War II. Satellite imagery showed the transformation. Before the war, Grozny appeared as a normal Soviet city with apartment blocks, parks, and tree-lined streets. After the bombardment, it was simply gone, replaced by a moonscape of rubble and collapsed buildings. Muscatov, still claiming to be Chechnya's legitimate president, found his authority evaporating as the Russian assault progressed. More radical commanders like Basayev rejected his calls for negotiation, insisting on continued resistance even as the military situation became hopeless. The resistance fragmented into autonomous groups operating independently in different regions. Some still fought for Chechen independence. Others had embraced jihad as an end in itself, part of a global Islamic struggle against unbelievers. The distinction mattered to analysts, but meant little to Russian forces, who made no effort to differentiate between nationalist rebels and Islamist radicals. The rebels' desperation produced increasingly horrific attacks on Russian civilians. In October 2002, a group of Chechen militants seized a Moscow theater during a performance, taking approximately 800 hostages. They demanded Russian withdrawal from Chechnya. For 3 days, the siege continued while Russian authorities negotiated and planned. Then, without warning to the hostages, Russian special forces pumped an aerosol narcotic gas into the theater's ventilation system. The gas was meant to incapacitate everyone inside, allowing security forces to storm the building and kill the terrorists before they could detonate their explosives. The plan succeeded in preventing the hostage-takers from blowing up the theater, but the gas itself proved fatal. At least 129 hostages died from the effects of the narcotic agent, which Russian authorities refused to identify even to doctors treating survivors. 2 years later came Beslan. In September 2004, a group including Chechen, Ingush, and other North Caucasian militants seized a school in the southern Russian town of Beslan on the first day of classes. They herded more than 1,100 people, most of them children, into the school gymnasium and held them for 3 days in sweltering heat without adequate food or water. The siege ended in carnage when explosions triggered a chaotic assault by Russian forces. More than 300 people died, including 186 children. The Beslan massacre destroyed whatever remaining international sympathy the Chechen cause have enjoyed. Moskadov denounced the attack, calling the perpetrators madmen, but his words could not undo the damage to the reputation of Chechen resistance. By 2005, the war was effectively over as a conventional conflict. Russian forces had established control over Chechnya's cities and major roads. Moskadov was killed by Russian special forces in March 2005. Basayev survived until July 2006, when he died in an explosion that Russian authorities claimed to have caused. The resistance continued at a low level, with periodic bombings and ambushes, but these were now isolated incidents rather than part of a coordinated insurgency. By 2009, large-scale combat operations had ceased. Russia had won at enormous cost. Hundreds of thousands dead, an entire capital city reduced to rubble, and the Chechen independence movement crushed. Moscow installed a pro-Russian administration under Akhmad Kadyrov, a former insurgent who had switched sides. Though his assassination in 2004 would pass control to his son Ramzan. The wars were over, but their legacy would poison Chechen society for generations. Chapter 5. The Unwritten Code. A Chechen proverb, spoken quietly in countless homes across generations, captures the essence of how children should be raised. Imanan gilachan kekalan ketaman buchzima lientiken teken tek bu. In translation, it means that faith, politeness, intellect, and consciousness are laid in childhood. This single sentence, passed from parent to child like a precious heirloom, reveals how deeply Chechens understand that culture is not merely inherited, but carefully cultivated from the earliest moments of a person's life. Everything that makes a Chechen recognizably Chechen, every gesture of respect and every act of hospitality, every suppressed emotion and every carefully chosen word, begins in the family home, where children absorb the unwritten code that will govern their behavior for decades to come. At the very heart of this code sits a concept so fundamental that it shapes nearly every social interaction, the idea captured in the phrase Yach chilar yuchlar yar. The words resist simple translation, but their meaning pulses through Chechen society like blood through veins. To have yach is to possess honor, dignity, and inner pride. To keep one's face, yuchlar yar, means to maintain that honor in the eyes of others through proper conduct. Within yach itself reside specific qualities that define the ideal Chechen character. Mairala, the courage to face adversity without flinching. Donala, the will to persist when circumstances would excuse surrender. Signos Dangala, the nobility of spirit that elevates a person above petty concerns. Kinkitam, the kindness that softens strength with compassion, and komarshala, the generosity that gives without expectation of return. A Chechen does not act for personal glory or material gain. The highest expression of Yach involves performing brave deeds for the benefit of others, saving lives, serving the community, all without waiting for gratitude or praise. This is not abstract philosophy, but concrete expectation, enforced not by law, but by the far more powerful mechanism of social judgment. From this central concept flows a pattern of behavior that strikes outsiders as remarkably restrained, even formal. Self-control dominates traditional Chechen interactions. The free expression of emotions, so valued in some cultures, is viewed in Chechen society as inappropriate, even shameful. A man does not laugh loudly or gesture wildly in public. A woman does not cry openly or show distress even when grief tears at her heart. Both genders practice sobar, a word meaning restraint or self-control, that represents one of the highest virtues in the Chechen moral universe. This emotional suppression intensifies in times of crisis. When disaster strikes, when enemies threaten, when death visits a household, the Chechen response is not theatrical mourning, but dignified composure. To maintain control when circumstances would excuse its loss demonstrates the strength of character that earns respect from one's neighbors and ancestors alike. Yet this emphasis on restraint and formality coexists with perhaps the most expansive hospitality tradition in the Caucasus. When a stranger approaches a Chechen home, even unannounced and unexpected, he may be greeted with Marsha Oila, enter into freedom, an invitation that signals the beginning of a carefully choreographed performance of welcome. The guest receives the best food the household can provide, prepared with care and served with attention to his preferences. Traditional Chechen cuisine, though simple in ingredients, reflects the same values of generosity that govern all hospitality. Dishes feature lamb, beef, or chicken, often prepared with garlic and served with jijigalnash, small dumplings in a rich broth, or hingalsh, flatbreads filled with pumpkin or cheese. The guest receives the choicest portions, the most tender meat, the freshest bread. He receives the most comfortable sleeping accommodation, often the family's own best room, while the hosts make do with lesser spaces. If the guest admires an object in the home, a beautifully woven carpet or a fine example of traditional metalwork, the host faces an obligation to present it as a gift. This is not mere generosity, but adherence to a code older than anyone can remember, a code that says the guest's satisfaction matters more than the host's material possessions. The physical positioning during hospitality observances carries its own meanings. The host sits closest to the door, the position of least honor, while the guest occupies the place furthest from the entrance, the safest and most protected spot in the room. This reversal of what might seem natural, the master of the house taking the inferior position while a stranger receives the place of honor, communicates volumes about Chechen values. The guest is sacred. His safety and comfort are the host's responsibility. Should danger arrive, the host positioned by the door will face it first, giving the guest time to escape or prepare. The host remains at the table until the last guest has finished eating and departed. To leave while guests remain would constitute a profound insult, suggesting that the host values his own comfort over his duty to those he has welcomed into his home. When neighbors or relatives visit, and in traditional Chechen society, visiting formed a crucial part of social life, the younger generation assumes the role of servers. Young men and younger family members bring food and drink, clear dishes, attend to guests' needs. The wife of the house may prepare the food, may direct its service, but in traditional households she does not join the men at table. In some families, particularly in earlier generations, a Chechen wife was not permitted to eat with her husband or to speak to his relatives. Her role emphasized subordination, at least in public settings. Behind closed doors, away from the observing eyes of society, the reality often differed considerably from these surface forms. The mother who had raised worthy sons commanded genuine respect and wielded considerable influence over major family decisions. When a woman entered a room, men stood in acknowledgement of her presence, particularly if she had achieved the status that age and motherhood conferred. For any Chechen, the greatest imaginable shame was to dishonor his mother or her relatives. This gave mothers tremendous power, despite the public customs that suggested female subservience, creating a paradox that runs throughout Chechen gender relations. Women occupy subordinate positions in the formal social hierarchy while exercising substantial authority within the family sphere. The expectations surrounding guests extended beyond the immediate hospitality to create networks of reciprocal obligation. A family that had been hosted was expected to return the invitation to welcome their former hosts with equal or greater generosity. These exchanges built and maintained relationships across types and villages, creating social bonds that could prove crucial in times of need. A young Chechen growing up in this environment learned that every interaction carried weight, that casual rudeness was not merely impolite but potentially dangerous to his family's standing in the community. The casual attitude toward guests that began appearing among younger Chechens in recent decades, particularly those educated in Russian cities or exposed to European customs, irritates older generations precisely because it represents a break with this ancient pattern. The formality and restraint that governed adult Chechen behavior began its cultivation in early childhood through lessons both explicit and subtle. Consider the father who discovers that his son has begun smoking cigarettes. He does not confront the boy directly. Instead, he makes his suggestion through the boy's mother, pointing out the harm and inadmissibility of the habit. But the lesson does not end there. Having condemned smoking in his son, the father must immediately give up cigarettes himself if he smokes. To demand behavior from a child while not modeling it oneself would be hypocrisy of the worst sort, a failure of the very yach that the father is trying to instill in his son. This pattern of education through example, rather than mere command, shapes Chechen child-rearing across countless domains. When children quarrel or fight among themselves, parents follow a rule that seems counterintuitive to those raised in cultures that emphasize defending one's own offspring. The Chechen parent, witnessing a dispute between his child and another, scolds his own child first and publicly before attempting to determine who actually bears fault for the disagreement. Only after demonstrating that he does not automatically take his child's side does the parent investigate what happened and render judgment. This practice teaches children that their parents' support is not unconditional, that poor behavior will be condemned even when, perhaps especially when, others are watching. It also maintains peace between families, since no parent can accuse another of blindly defending a child who deserves correction. The reverence for elders, fundamental to the Teip system, manifests in countless small rituals of daily life. A younger person must always let an elder pass first through a doorway. When walking together, the younger stays slightly behind, a positioning that mirrors the custom of women walking behind men to ensure that men face danger first. When greeting an elder, the younger speaks with particular courtesy and respect, using formal modes of address that have largely vanished from casual Russian speech but survives in Chechen interactions. To interrupt an elder who is speaking is considered tactless at best, profoundly rude at worst. A young person does not begin a conversation with an elder without being invited to speak or waiting for an appropriate pause. These are not suggestions but requirements enforced by the disapproval of anyone who witnesses a violation. Among the most serious insults one Chechen man can offer another is to touch his hat. The papaka, the traditional Caucasian fur hat worn by Chechen men, is not merely a piece of clothing but a symbol of masculine honor. For someone to reach out and touch or remove another man's hat without permission is tantamount to a physical assault, a public slap to the face that demands immediate response. This explains why traditional Chechen men treat their hats with such care, why the hat occupies a special place in the home when not being worn, why a man putting on his papaka performs a small ritual of preparation before appearing in public. The hat represents the man's standing in society, his yach made visible in wool and fur. These customs of respect and formality extend even into the most intimate sphere of family life. A Chechen wife, particularly in traditional practice, must feed her husband's parents before feeding her husband. The elders eat first, receiving the best portions, and only after their satisfaction is the younger generation permitted to take their own meal. This reverses the priority that might seem natural, where a wife attends to her husband's needs before all others, and instead reinforces the supreme importance of the older generation. The young couple may be the future of the family line, but the elders remain the source of wisdom and the link to ancestral tradition that gives the family its identity. These customs of respect and formality extend even into the most intimate sphere of family life. A Chechen wife, particularly in traditional practice, must feed her husband's parents before feeding her husband. The elders eat first, receiving the best portions, and only after their satisfaction is the younger generation permitted to take their own meal. This reverses the priority that might seem natural, where a wife attends to her husband's needs before all others, and instead reinforces the supreme importance of the older generation. The young couple may be the future of the family line, but the elders remain the source of wisdom and the link to ancestral tradition that gives the family its identity. Marriage itself involves customs that balance individual choice with family interest and social expectation. Even when young people choose their own partners, as most now do, they typically seek parental approval before proceeding. Parents exert considerable pressure on their children to marry other Chechens, maintaining ethnic identity and ensuring that grandchildren will be raised in Chechen traditions. For women, this pressure is particularly intense, since in Chechen understanding, a married woman belongs to the culture of her husband. A Chechen woman who marries outside the ethnic group is often regarded as lost to her people, her children unlikely to identify as truly Chechen. The dowry system functions not as a purchase price but as insurance. The groom's family pays a substantial amount to the bride's family, or sometimes directly to the bride herself. This payment serves as a guarantee against divorce, a security ensuring that the marriage will be treated seriously by all parties. A man who has paid a significant dowry has a financial incentive to make the marriage work. At traditional weddings, the bride follows an ancient custom that extends across Central Asia and the Caucasus. She refrains from smiling or showing joy on her wedding day. This is not because she is unhappy, but because displaying happiness might attract the envy of others, and envy can bring bad luck or misfortune. By maintaining a solemn, even sad expression, the bride protects herself and her new family from the evil eye. The cultural traditions that make Chechens distinctive find expression not only in these social customs, but in artistic forms that have survived despite repeated attempts at suppression. The epic poems called Elesh carried history and values across generations when writing was rare and literacy limited to a few. These long narrative poems, recited by skilled storytellers who could hold an audience for hours, encoded the moral universe of traditional Chechen society. They told of heroic ancestors defending their land against overwhelming odds, of wise elders who resolved conflicts through clever negotiation rather than violence, of tragic lovers separated by circumstances beyond their control. Through these stories, Chechen children learned their history and absorbed the values their society held dear. The tradition continues today in modified form, with some of the old Elash preserved in writing and new stories composed to address contemporary concerns while maintaining connection to the ancient narrative tradition. Music and dance provide another window into Chechen cultural identity. Traditional Chechen dance follows patterns common throughout the Caucasus, but with distinctive elements that mark it as specifically Chechen. Dancers perform a characteristic double-step stride. Each dancer taps first with the point of the foot, then follows rapidly with a heel stomp, creating a gallop-like aesthetic that distinguishes Chechen dance from the similar but not identical styles practiced by Georgians, Armenians, or other Caucasian peoples. The dancers move with controlled energy, embodying in motion the same restraint and dignity that governs other aspects of Chechen behavior. Traditional instruments like the fandar, a stringed instrument unique to the region, provide musical accompaniment, their melodies carrying echoes of centuries of mountain life. Even in matters of dress, tradition persists despite modern influences and changing fashions. In Chechnya itself, expectations about appropriate clothing remain conservative, particularly for women. Miniskirts, tight-fitting trousers, low necklines, and transparent blouses are considered inappropriate, violations of modesty that bring shame on the wearer and her family. Shoulders should be covered. Legs should be covered at least to the knees. These standards reflect both Islamic influence and older Chechen values of modesty and propriety. Through all these customs, from the elaborate hospitality rituals to the restraint in emotional expression, from the reverence for elders to the preservation of dance and story, runs a consistent thread: the determination to remain distinctly Chechen despite centuries of pressure to assimilate. Every time a young person lets an elder pass first, every time a host gives a treasured possession to an admiring guest, every time a dancer performs the double-step stride of traditional Chechen choreography, the culture renews itself. These are not museum pieces, not curiosities maintained for tourists or scholars, but living practices that continue to shape Chechen identity in the 21st century as surely as they did in centuries past. The traditions have survived conquest, deportation, war, and modernization precisely because they serve functions deeper than mere custom. They provide a framework for understanding who Chechens are and what they value, a framework flexible enough to adapt to changing circumstances, yet strong enough to resist erasure even when the full power of the Russian and Soviet states was directed toward that end. Chapter 6: The Kadyrov Regime. The wars ended not with peace, but with a different form of violence, one wearing the mask of order and stability. When the guns finally fell silent across Chechnya in the late 2000s, after a decade of destruction that had killed hundreds of thousands and flattened the capital as completely as Hiroshima with conventional artillery, bombs, and missiles, the Russian government needed local faces to administer what remained. They found their man in an unlikely place, among the very insurgents who had fought them. Ahmad Kadyrov had been a respected Sufi sheikh who initially supported Chechen independence during the First War. He served as mufti, the highest religious authority for the breakaway Chechen Republic of Ichkeria. But by the time the Second War erupted in 1999, Kadyrov had turned decisively against the independence movement. What drove this transformation remains debated. Kadyrov himself claimed that the increasing radicalization of the Chechen resistance, its embrace of Wahhabi Islam imported by foreign fighters, had become intolerable. He could not support a movement that rejected the traditional Sufi practices he had spent his life promoting. Others suggested more cynical calculations, that Kadyrov recognized the inevitable Russian victory and positioned himself to benefit from collaboration. Whatever his motivations, the practical result was clear. Kadyrov brought with him fighters who had battled Russian forces but now redirected their weapons against their former comrades. These men, bound to Kadyrov by personal loyalty rather than ideology, became the foundation of a security apparatus that would prove more effective at crushing resistance than Russian forces had ever managed. In October 2003, Kadyrov was installed as president of Chechnya in elections that international observers charitably described as flawed. He had little time to consolidate his rule. On May 9, 2004, Victory Day, commemorating the Soviet defeat of Nazi Germany, Kadyrov attended a ceremony at Dynamo Stadium in Grozny. He took his seat in the VIP section, surrounded by other officials and dignitaries. Beneath his chair, insurgents had planted a bomb powerful enough to tear through reinforced concrete. The explosion killed Kadyrov instantly, along with several others seated nearby. Russian authorities blamed Chechen separatists. The separatists claimed responsibility. The brief experiment in rule by the elder Kadyrov had ended in blood and fire, as so many Chechen political ventures had before it. But Kadyrov's death did not end his family's grip on power. His son Ramzan, only 27 years old when his father was assassinated, maneuvered to inherit the position despite being constitutionally too young for the presidency. Ramzan had spent his youth not in universities or government ministries, but in military camps. During the Second War, while still in his early 20s, he commanded a paramilitary unit fighting alongside Russian forces against Chechen insurgents. He gained a reputation for ruthlessness and effectiveness, qualities that recommended him to both his father and to the Russian authorities who ultimately held power over Chechnya's fate. When his father died, Ramzan became first deputy prime minister, effectively running Chechnya while others held the nominal top position. In February 2007, having just passed his 30th birthday, the minimum constitutional age for the presidency, Ramzan Kadyrov became president of the Chechen Republic with Vladimir Putin's explicit blessing. What Kadyrov built in the years that followed defies easy categorization. Chechnya remained formally a subject of the Russian Federation, bound by Russian law and supposedly governed according to the Russian constitution. In practice, Kadyrov created a personal fiefdom where his word carried more weight than any law, where loyalty to him personally mattered more than competence or legality, where brutal violence maintained an order that critics called peace only because the alternative had been even worse. He became one of the few leaders of a constituent republic to retain a sizable measure of political independence under Putin's aggressive centralization of power, ruling like a feudal lord despite coming from a culture that had never known feudalism, concentrating authority in ways that violated every principle of traditional Chechen social organization based on autonomous clans and councils of elders. The most visible manifestation of Kadyrov's power was the Kadyrovtsi, his personal security force composed of men who owed allegiance to him rather than to the Russian state or any institution beyond his control. Many of these fighters were former insurgents who had switched sides, men who knew intimately the methods of the resistance because they had employed those methods themselves before deciding that collaboration offered better prospects than continued struggle. They dressed in distinctive uniforms, often featuring images of Kadyrov or his father, and operated with impunity throughout Chechnya. Human rights organizations documented systematic torture in facilities controlled by the Kadyrovtsi. Hundreds of people disappeared from their homes in the night, taken away in vehicles without license plates. Some eventually returned, traumatized and broken. Others were never seen again. Families knew better than to ask too many questions about the disappeared. Asking questions could make you disappear as well. In 2006, even before Ramzan officially became president, Human Rights Watch published a detailed report documenting these practices. The organization's researchers found that disappearances and torture had become so widespread and systematic that they constituted crimes against humanity under international law. The report noted that these abuses were not the work of rogue elements operating beyond government control, but rather reflected official policy implemented by forces directly answerable to the Kadyrov family. The younger Kadyrov's government responded not by investigating the allegations, but by condemning the report as anti-Chechen propaganda, attempting to discredit the researchers rather than address the substance of their findings. Yet even as his security forces terrorized anyone perceived as disloyal or threatening, Kadyrov positioned himself as a builder and modernizer. He directed enormous sums of Russian federal money toward reconstructing Grozny, transforming what had been described as the most destroyed city on earth into a gleaming showpiece. Russian subsidies kept the entire Chechen budget afloat, pouring in billions of rubles that funded not just reconstruction, but the entire apparatus of government. New high-rise apartment buildings sprouted from the ruins. Broad avenues replaced streets that had been mere paths through rubble. Parks were landscaped with imported trees and elaborate fountains. The centerpiece of this reconstruction was the Ahmad Kadyrov Mosque, named for Ramzan's father, an enormous structure built in traditional Ottoman style with towering minarets visible from across the city. This mosque, along with several others constructed during Kadyrov's rule, projected an image of Chechnya as prosperous, Islamic, and firmly under control. The rebuilt Grozny served multiple purposes for Kadyrov's regime. It demonstrated to Chechens that loyalty brought material benefits, that the stability imposed by Kadyrov's iron rule allowed for economic development impossible during the war years. It showed the Russian government that its enormous financial investment in Chechnya was producing visible results, justifying continued subsidies. And perhaps most importantly, it provided propaganda value, images of a modern city that could be shown to foreign observers as evidence that Chechnya had moved beyond its violent past. The reality beneath this shiny surface was more complicated. Much of the population remained desperately poor despite the new buildings. Unemployment stayed stubbornly high, hovering above 20% by official figures and likely higher in reality. The wealth flowing into Chechnya enriched those connected to Kadyrov's inner circle while leaving ordinary citizens struggling to survive on salaries that barely covered basic necessities. Kadyrov's version of Islam, promoted through the mosques he built and the religious education he sponsored, carefully balanced competing demands. On one hand, he presented himself as a pious Muslim, ostentatiously observing prayers and religious holidays, enforcing Islamic dress codes for women, and suppressing alcohol sales in some areas. This religious posturing served to legitimate his rule in the eyes of a population that remained deeply Muslim despite Soviet attempts at atheistic indoctrination. It also helped differentiate his acceptable, state-controlled Islam from the radical Wahhabism that he condemned as a foreign intrusion threatening Chechen traditions. The government required women in many public settings to wear headscarves. Universities and government offices enforced dress codes that prohibited clothing Kadyrov deemed immodest. Young women who appeared in public without proper covering might face verbal harassment or worse from roving groups of Kadyrovtsi enforcers who conducted spot checks on city streets. Yet this official promotion of Islamic observance had strict limits. Religious leaders who challenged Kadyrov's authority found themselves in prison or dead. When a respected imam named Israilov criticized the government's human rights record, he was abducted and murdered, his body showing signs of torture. The Islam supported by the state emphasized loyalty, obedience, and acceptance of divinely ordained hierarchy rather than justice or resistance to oppression. Sufi practices were encouraged, but only those Sufi teachers who explicitly supported the Kadyrov regime were permitted to operate openly. This created a controlled religious sphere where Islam served the state rather than providing any kind of alternative moral framework that might question government actions. Women and sexual minorities bore particular burdens under Kadyrov's rule. Despite Chechnya's history of according women certain protections and respect within traditional frameworks, the modern Kadyrov regime imposed restrictions that went far beyond traditional practice. Women faced pressure to marry young, often in their teens, and to have large families. Educational opportunities contracted, as government officials suggested publicly that women's education beyond basic levels was unnecessary. Professional careers became difficult as implicit and explicit barriers blocked women from positions of authority in government, business, and even healthcare and education where Soviet-era Chechen women had once worked freely alongside men. Dress codes grew increasingly restrictive, enforced not just by law but by social pressure and the ever-present threat of Kadyrovtsi intervention. Even more vulnerable were Chechnya's LGBT citizens. Beginning in 2017, Kadyrov's government launched what international observers could only describe as a purge. Over 100 men suspected of being gay were rounded up, detained in secret facilities, tortured, and in some cases killed. The government denied that any such campaign had occurred, with one spokesman claiming bizarrely that there could be no gay men in Chechnya because Chechen families would have killed them already. Survivors who managed to escape Chechnya and speak to human rights workers told harrowing stories of beatings, electric shocks, and threats against their families. Some detainees were released to their relatives with instructions that the families should kill them to cleanse the family honor. These anti-gay purges, documented by multiple international organizations, revealed the extremes to which Kadyrov's regime would go to enforce its vision of proper Chechen identity. Throughout all this repression, Kadyrov maintained close ties to Vladimir Putin, understanding correctly that his power ultimately rested on Putin's support. He positioned himself as Putin's most loyal subordinate, reliably delivering Chechen votes in Russian elections with implausibly high percentages of support for Putin and his United Russia Party. In return, Putin provided the money that funded Kadyrov's reconstruction projects and the political protection that allowed him to operate with minimal oversight from Moscow. This relationship made Kadyrov virtually untouchable within the Russian system. When human rights activists or journalists documented abuses in Chechnya, their complaints disappeared into bureaucratic black holes. When the United States imposed financial sanctions on Kadyrov in 2017, explicitly accusing him of systematic human rights violations and extrajudicial killings, the Russian government dismissed the accusations as politically motivated interference. That same year, Reporters Without Borders added Kadyrov to its list of predators of press freedom, citing his role in the murder and intimidation of journalists who dared report on Chechnya. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. This carefully curated online persona presented Kadyrov as strong, pious, modern, and in control, a leader who combined traditional values with contemporary style. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. This carefully curated online persona presented Kadyrov as strong, pious, modern, and in control, a leader who combined traditional values with contemporary style. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. This carefully curated online persona presented Kadyrov as strong, pious, modern, and in control, a leader who combined traditional values with contemporary style. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. This carefully curated online persona presented Kadyrov as strong, pious, modern, and in control, a leader who combined traditional values with contemporary style. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. This carefully curated online persona presented Kadyrov as strong, pious, modern, and in control, a leader who combined traditional values with contemporary style. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and other platforms with videos and photographs that showed him working out in elaborate gyms, playing with exotic animals, meeting with religious leaders, and inspecting construction projects. The same platforms that carried his propaganda also served as tools of intimidation, with critics and dissidents finding their photographs posted alongside threats from Kadyrov's followers. Kadyrov proved adept at using modern technology to project his power and shape his image. He maintained an extensive social media presence, posting frequently on Instagram and the centralization of power in Kadyrov's hands represented a profound break with traditional Chechen political culture. The Teip system, the councils of elders, the democratic traditions that had allowed Chechens to live for centuries without kings or central authority all became casualties of Kadyrov's consolidation of control. Teips still existed as social units, people still identified with their clans, but the political power these institutions once wielded had evaporated. Decisions that once would have been made collectively by respected elders were now made by Kadyrov alone or by subordinates acting in his name. The egalitarianism that had characterized traditional Chechen society, the sense that Chechens were free and equal like wolves, survived only as nostalgic memory. In its place stood a hierarchy with Kadyrov at its apex, his relatives and close associates in the tier below, and the mass of ordinary Chechens reduced to subjects in all but name. This transformation occurred not through Chechen choice, but through exhaustion and terror. 2 wars had killed perhaps 200,000 people, roughly 1/5 of the Chechen population. Virtually every family had lost members. The infrastructure of normal life had been destroyed. In such circumstances, Kadyrov's offer became grimly appealing. Accept his rule, stop resisting, and you can rebuild your homes, educate your children, live without the constant fear of bombs and artillery. The alternative was more war, more destruction, more death. Faced with this choice, most Chechens accepted Kadyrov's bargain, even as they understood its terrible price. Yet resistance persisted, though driven underground and often taking forms more desperate than effective. Young Chechen men, despairing of any future under Kadyrov's suffocating rule, sometimes fled abroad to join extremist groups fighting in Syria, Iraq, or other conflict zones. These foreign fighters saw themselves as continuing the struggle against Russian domination by fighting Russia's allies in Middle Eastern wars. The Kadyrov regime used their departures as propaganda, pointing to these radicals as evidence that harsh measures were necessary to prevent terrorism. The logic became self-fulfilling. Repression created the very extremism it claimed to prevent, which justified further repression in an endless cycle. The COVID pandemic beginning in 2020 gave Kadyrov new opportunities to demonstrate his power. Chechnya implemented some of Russia's strictest lockdown measures, with security forces aggressively enforcing restrictions on movement and assembly. Kadyrov personally appeared in videos posted to his social media accounts, warning Chechens in stern tones to follow public health guidelines, his message combining fatherly concern with implicit threats about the consequences of disobedience. The pandemic also provided cover for further restrictions on what little civil society remained in Chechnya, with meetings and gatherings banned under public health pretexts that conveniently also prevented any form of political organizing. The COVID pandemic beginning in 2020 gave Kadyrov new opportunities to demonstrate his power. Chechnya implemented some of Russia's strictest lockdown measures, with security forces aggressively enforcing restrictions on movement and assembly. Kadyrov personally appeared in videos posted to his social media accounts, warning Chechens in stern tones to follow public health guidelines, his message combining fatherly concern with implicit threats about the consequences of disobedience. The pandemic also provided cover for further restrictions on what little civil society remained in Chechnya, with meetings and gatherings banned under public health pretexts that conveniently also prevented any form of political organizing. When Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, Kadyrov became one of the most vocal supporters of the war. Chechen units, some composed of Kadyrov T fighters, deployed to Ukraine where they gained a reputation for brutality, particularly in occupied areas. Kadyrov himself appeared regularly on social media, encouraging the war effort, criticizing Russian military leaders for insufficient aggression, and claiming that Chechen forces were winning victories while Russian units struggled. These claims often bore little relationship to reality on the battlefield, but they served Kadyrov's domestic purposes, demonstrating his loyalty to Putin while building a narrative of Chechen martial superiority that appealed to traditional values of courage and military prowess. By the mid-2020s, Kadyrov had been ruling Chechnya for nearly 2 decades, longer than many Chechens could remember any other leader. He had become, in the assessment of observers both inside and outside Russia, one of the most powerful and most feared men in the country. His power rested on violence and the credible threat of violence, on vast sums of Russian money, and on his understanding of how to manage his relationship with the Kremlin. But it also rested on exhaustion, on a population that had endured too much for too long and lacked the strength to mount yet another rebellion against yet another form of domination. The future of Chechnya under Kadyrov's rule remained uncertain in fundamental ways. His health, the subject of occasional rumors and speculation, could fail. His relationship with Putin or Putin's successors could fracture. The enormous Russian subsidies that kept Chechnya's economy functioning could dry up. Yet planning for a post-Kadyrov Chechnya proved nearly impossible because his regime had so thoroughly destroyed any alternative centers of power or authority. The religious leaders who might once have provided moral guidance were dead, imprisoned, or co-opted. The clan elders who might have mediated disputes and organized collective action had been marginalized. The intellectuals who might have articulated a vision of a different future had fled into exile or learned to keep silent. What Kadyrov had created was not stability in any meaningful sense, but rather the absence of active conflict, maintained through fear and force. The traditions explored in earlier chapters, the Teip system and the codes of honor, the Sufi Islam and the practices of hospitality, all persisted in modified forms beneath the surface of Kadyrov's Chechnya. But they persisted in the private sphere, in homes and hearts, rather than in the public realm that Kadyrov's regime had claimed for itself through violence. And so the Chechen people, who had survived so much across so many centuries, survived this as well, waiting with the patience born of bitter experience to see what the future might bring. The story of the Chechen people reveals a profound truth about the resilience of cultural identity. From their unique egalitarian clan system to their synthesis of Islam with ancient traditions, from Stalin's attempt at total erasure to 2 devastating wars and now authoritarian rule, the Chechens have endured what would have destroyed most peoples. Their survival demonstrates that culture lives not in buildings or borders, but in memory, in the stories parents whisper to children, in customs maintained despite prohibitions, in identities that persist across generations of trauma. The Chechen experience raises uncomfortable questions about the price of survival and the forms that resistance must take when open defiance becomes impossible. It reminds us that the human capacity to endure is matched only by the human capacity to inflict suffering, and that some struggles span not years but centuries. Thank you for listening.